Now, the little straw poll I'd like to do is, how many of you are here because you want to hear about Fidel Castro? Okay, and how many are here because you want to hear about Errol Flynn?
Both.
But it's interesting. Okay, but it's interesting.
Errol Flynn because he was a Tasmanian.
Oh, you're Tasmanian.
Tasmanian.
Well, it's interesting because when I do that, I get a couple of hands that go up for Fidel Castro, but most of the hands go up for Errol Flynn. Yeah, well, you did for both, so that's, you're getting what is it? Odds on. No, what do you call it? Each way.
Each way. Yeah.
I've got to get my Melbourne Cup.
Way.
Got to get my Melbourne Cup terminology right. Yes, most people seem to be interested in Errol Flynn. Now, maybe that's because it's Australia. If it was in America, they'd probably be more interested in Fidel Castro. But there seems to be, I think, the thing about Errol Flynn is that most Australians, even now, don't know that he's Australian. It's only probably in the last 10 years that people have started to understand that he was. In America, they still don't know. In America, they still think he's an American of Irish descent. When they write about him, they even now they'll write and they'll say Errol Flynn was born in Tasmania, an island to the south of Australia. Now, that would suggest they don't know what Tasmania is or where Tasmania is. It's somewhere in the South Pacific and it's somewhere around Australia. It's not part of Australia. Now, I have seen that exact terminology, an island to the south of Australia, a dozen times in a dozen different descriptions of Errol Flynn's history. But yes, the fact is that he is Australian. He was Australian, sorry. He was, until he became a naturalised American citizen in about 1942. By that stage, he was, in his 30s. He was born in Hobart, but that was accidental. His parents were actually from Sydney. They were married in Balmain, and his father was a marine biologist. In fact, he eventually became the most respected marine biologist in the world. He was on an excursion down to the Antarctic, and with his wife, with his relatively new wife. And as they...
Patricia Wyman, wasn't it?
Sorry?
Patricia Wyman?
No, that was his...
third wife?
That was his, no, not Patricia Wyman. You're thinking of his third wife, who had a name like that. I'll think of it in a minute. No, I'm talking about his father's wife.
Oh, right.
His mother, his name was Mariel. Well, she had a number. She was called Mariel or Morel, but that wasn't her official name. They found out that she was pregnant on the journey, on the voyage. So they stopped the boat at Hobart and offloaded her because she couldn't stay in Antarctic for 6 months in her condition. She stayed in Hobart while the father, Errol Flynn's father, continued on to Antarctic and came back and decided that because she'd put down roots in Hobart, so they decided to stay. And he got a sinecure at the University of Tasmania. Now that's how Errol started, and that's how he happened to be Tasmanian, but he certainly was Australian. His parents were both Australians for many generations. His father of Irish descent, and his mother of English descent by way of the Bounty. She, one of her ancestors, I think about her great-grandfather, was one of the Bounty mutineers, which is rather ironic because that was Errol Flynn's first film. It's called In the Wake of the Bounty, an Australian film. Now, that's a little background about Errol Flynn. I think most people know about Fidel Castro. What you may not know, what I, for instance, didn't know when I set off on this, embarked on this particular project, was just what Fidel Castro was like before the revolution, before he became a world figure. In 1958 and 59, which is what this novel covers, it's the end of well, he called it the beginning of the revolution, but it was actually the end of the war. It was the end of the violent uprising, the struggle, which happened to end very suddenly. 1958, I think there's someone trying to get in.
Sorry.
That's all right.
My apologies.
1958, 1959. The revolution in Havana finished in its violent phase on the 1st of January 1959. And if anyone's seen The Godfather, you'll know how that happened. If you've seen Godfather 2, there's a scene in it where the Godfather, Al Pacino, is attending a big New Year's Eve party in Havana. He's just been doing the deals with the character based on Meyer Lansky and so on, and all the head mafia honchos are there. And they've gone to President Batista's New Year's Eve party. In the middle of the party, Batista hears news that the country's been cut in half by a battle that's just been won by Che Guevara in a town called Santa Clara, about halfway along the island. And suddenly the country is split in two. There's no communication between north and south, or potentially no communication between north and south, or east and west. So he realised, well, the writing was on the wall, and he thought, well, why am I doing this? And he literally did a moonlight flick that night, took off with all the gold out of the treasury, and left a number of generals in his wake. But none of those generals was able to form a government in the next couple of days. Fidel Castro called a national strike. Everyone went out. All the workers laid down, and the sugar plantations laid down tools and so on. Fidel Castro then did a 1-week victory parade from the far east of the country, in a town called Santiago de Cuba, all the way up over a period of a week, all the way up to Havana, and arrived in Havana anointed as the new leader of Havana, new leader of Cuba. Now, where all this becomes relevant to the story I'm writing is that when Fidel Castro rode into Havana in his victory parade on a tank, on the next tank right behind him was Errol Flynn. Now, when you hear that, you immediately think, well, that's of course preposterous. Errol Flynn, you know, the fading movie star of the 40s, the king of the swashbucklers, on the next tank in a serious revolution. This is not a Hollywood film, this is a serious revolution. Well, it was true. When I first heard that, I went and the other story I heard was that when Castro achieved his victory, it had happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, even to someone like Fidel Castro, that the only I use the term loosely, foreign correspondent in Havana, or not even in Havana, in Santiago de Cuba, which is where Castro was, the only foreign correspondent was Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn decided to, he realised that he was the only person with access to the American press. So he filed a story. So that's how the story broke. That's how the story broke to the world, that Errol Flynn broke the story to the world that Fidel Castro was now the leader in Cuba. Now, those two facts, if you were writing pure fiction, I would suggest that if that didn't happen, you'd be mad to even invent it, because it's just so preposterous. But in fact, it is true. Now, when I heard those two facts and was stimulated to go looking for it, if you Google it, you'll find that the internet is full of references to Errol Flynn and Fidel Castro. There's thousands of them. There's very little in the way of detail, but lots of people make reference to it. You'll even find some photographs, but the photographs aren't particularly good. The photographs you'll find, I have two here. This is one. There's Errol Flynn up there in the top left, and there's Fidel Castro down there. Now, this is straight after the victory, and that one, which are not exactly newsworthy photographs. These photographs I don't think ever made the newspapers. But to give you an idea of what it was, of how big this news was, this is the Los Angeles Times. I'm sure they talk about driving around snow, but look up here. Errol Flynn wounded as Castro man. Errol Flynn wounded as fighter with Castro. Now that story was published on the 6th of January. That's while the victory parade was still on its way north up to, or west up to Havana. That was because the journalists, the foreign correspondents, had all descended on Cuba, and they all wanted to find out what was Errol Flynn doing there, and how come he had released this story. And Errol told them, and they said, "Why are you limping?" Because he had a damaged leg, a sore leg. They said, "Why are you limping?" And he made up this story about how he was wounded. Now, that particular story has about 3 or 4 different versions. In one it was shrapnel, and another it was a bullet, and another it was flying wood because of bits of splinters of timber because he was standing by a door and the door splintered when a gunshot hit. The fact of the matter was he fell over and damaged his knee and hurt himself while he was shooting his film. Now that brings me to why he was down there in the first place. Errol Flynn went down there because he was, for a number of reasons. Number one, he was broke and was looking for owed a fortune, a fortune to us, a small fortune to Errol Flynn, owed a small fortune to the IRS. He was always a man who was looking for adventure. He went down there for an adventure. He wanted to get involved with this revolution that was happening down there. But he saw if he went down there and made a film about this revolution that's down there, he could write it off as a tax loss. So, as I say in the book, he wanted to lose his shirt, but say he lost the whole wardrobe. And if anyone's seen Mel Brooks' The Producers, you'll know the concept where you put on a show, you make a film, and you can hide all sorts of losses which you didn't actually make in the production of a film or putting on a stage play. That's what he wanted to do. Lose money on this film. But then he realised that there was more to this revolution than just the opportunity to give himself a tax break. There was an adventure here. He was always a man who was looking for adventure. He used to call them romps. He said, I start out looking for a cause, and it all ends up in a romp. Now, what he really means by cause is he's looking for an adventure. He did back a couple of causes. Well, apart from, I guess there were only two. One was Fidel Castro. The other was in the Spanish Civil War. He backed the loyalists in the Spanish Civil War. Once again, he was looking for an adventure, and he decided that he could be like Hemingway. He could go across there, be part of it, write about it, and he came to an arrangement with William Randolph Hearst, who was an acquaintance of his, that he would supply stories back to the Hearst newspapers. This was in 1938. So he went across there, spent about a month over there, probably getting drunk, womanising and making a general fool of himself. But he also got involved with the loyalists, who were on the, if you remember that, they were the anti-Franco forces. So he was on the left there, even though sometime later there was a book probably saying he was a Nazi. His politics were always on the left. He spent about a month over there getting involved in the Spanish Civil War. But partly that was because he was trying to escape Hollywood. He was always running away from Hollywood because whenever he couldn't get what he wanted from Jack Warner, he would just disappear. He'd get on his boat and disappear for a few days until eventually Jack Warner would back down and say, "All right, I'll give you the extra, whatever it is you want, the bigger trailer, the extra salary, etc., etc., etc." He wasn't the only one to do that. A lot of them did that, but he was probably the most successful at it at that time because he had a boat he could disappear on. So that was probably the main reason he went to the Spanish Civil War. Secondary reason because he supported the loyalists. The main reason he went to Cuba was, firstly, to make this film, lose the money. Secondly, because he wanted to get involved with what looked like a big adventure. And thirdly, because he sort of supported Castro. So he went down there to make this film. To make this film, he needed the involvement of Castro, or he needed the involvement of the rebels, because he wanted, the film was called Cuban Rebel Girls, hence the title of the film, the book, Errol, Fidel and the Cuban Rebel Girls. This was the film he went down there to make, Cuban Rebel Girls. The story of this film, the plot is this is Errol with his girlfriend at the time, Beverly Adland. This would have been taken in 1959. She would have been 17. He was 49, 50. This girl is the star of Cuban Rebel Girls. Now, the part she plays is of a grill on your face. You know, it's just this film. If you ever get a chance to see this film, don't. I mean, it really is a terrible film. But the story is a hairdresser from New York, played by Beverly Adland. A hairdresser from New York discovers that her boyfriend has gone off down to Cuba to join the rebels, and she says, "Johnny's gone down to Cuba. I'm going to go down there. I'm going to go down there and find him, and I'm going to be a rebel girl." So the hairdresser goes down to Cuba, finds Johnny up in the mountains, and Johnny says, "You little idiot, what you doing here?" And that's essentially the plot of the film. And there's a couple of action scenes where they shoot some government soldiers, and eventually there's a victory parade. The victory parade they show in the film is the victory parade. They shot the victory parade, and there's Beverly sitting up on a tank. Now that's in the real victory parade. There was Errol further up, but they were filming Beverly on a tank. They actually stopped the victory parade for Beverly to jump down off the tank and run into the arms of her Johnny. This is history gone mad, but it's true. So all that, when you find out all this sort of stuff, I mean, you don't have to make too much up. Essentially, all the incidents in the book are based on fact, even bizarre ones like on New Year's Eve, the very night that Batista did his midnight flip. Castro was way down the other end of the country, 1,000 kilometres away, but he had just, Che Guevara won a battle halfway up the country. Well, Castro had also won a battle on that day in a town called Mafo, which is way down the east, just on the foothills of the mountains. And he was having his own little celebration because he just won this battle. Well, in the town's golf club, this is, as the battle is, the day the battle is finished, in the town's golf club, Errol Flynn throws a New Year's Eve party. It's true. He did. And Castro turned up at it, briefly. Now, I mean, it's situations like that, you know, you just cannot invent them because they're just too bizarre. It'd be science fiction otherwise, you know. So Errol went down there, he took Beverly, he made this film, but the film wasn't finished until he died. He died only 9 months later. He died in October 1959. The film was still unfinished. It came out later that year, came out a couple of months later. And it was a
What age did he die?
50. He'd only just turned 50.
No.
Yeah. But they said he had the body of an 80-year-old. Inside, the internal organs were yeah, a man about 80. I mean, you look at him. Look, that's not a man of 80, but it still doesn't look like Errol Flynn the way he looked in Robin Hood. You know, he's bloated. But then again, he is 50. But he's suffering. Look, he suffered from chronic malaria. He got malaria when he was in New Guinea. That was in his early 20s. He suffered from malaria for the rest of his life, as one did in those days. I suppose they still do. If you get malaria, it still sticks with you. He had, obviously, he had ongoing cirrhosis. He had heart problems. He had back problems. He'd almost broken his back when shooting a couple of films. Once was Captain Blood. He fell off the rigging onto the deck. That was his first big film in Hollywood. He fell off the rigging because he did all his own stunts in those days. And fell off the rigging and bang onto the deck. That damaged his back. And a couple of years later, he leapt from a balcony to another balcony and lost his grip and fell. After that, they said, you know, you've got to get a stuntman to do all these things because he was too valuable a star by this stage. He was okay with Captain Blood. He was virtually unknown. He'd only made a couple of small films, but suddenly he was, after Captain Blood, he was about the biggest name in Hollywood. And he was the biggest name in Hollywood for a number of years after that. He was the biggest name. He was one of the biggest names in Hollywood during the war for all the wrong reasons. Not necessarily positive for the films he was making. If you remember, he made a lot of war films at that time. Well, a lot of them were propaganda films that he was forced to make, and he became legendary for the man who won the war single-handedly and yet never joined up. Well, the fact is he tried to join up, but he had so many physical problems that they wouldn't take him. He was classed as 4F in selected services. Now, 4F means unrecruitable. Unrecruitable because of the damage to his back, because of the malaria, because of all the other heart problems and so on and so on. Now, Warner Brothers kept a lid on that. They wouldn't allow people to understand why he wasn't in the army or in the forces, because he was getting a lot of flack, a lot of negative publicity. But they didn't want people to understand that their big action film star was actually a 4F. So he had to wear all that. He also had a sensational trial for statutory rape during the war, which you've all probably heard the term, in like Flynn. It came from that trial in 1943 where he was accused of statutory rape. which in those days in America, I'm not sure if it still exists, but in those days statutory rape was sexual relations with a girl under a certain age, and that was different in different states. Now, that whole charge, I'm not saying that Errol didn't have sexual relations with girls of under a certain age, but that particular charge was trumped up by the LA Attorney's Office. They wanted to bring Hollywood down. Hollywood was too big and important in Los Angeles, so they wanted to bring it down. So they decided to go for the biggest and most vulnerable star in the biggest and most vulnerable stable, which is Warner Brothers. Was the biggest thing in American newspapers for weeks on end. It was bigger than the Second World War, all because of Errol Flynn. So he had a pretty rough trot of it during the war. After the war, his career went into decline slowly but inexorably. So by the time 1958 came around, he was in desperate need of money, which is why he went down to Cuba. Fidel Castro, for his part, you want to hear about Fidel? Now, Fidel in 1958 was not the Fidel of 1959, and certainly not the Fidel of about 1960 or 61. The Fidel of 1958 was a young man a young revolutionary man who was not a communist. He was interested in Marx, but that was about as far as it went. He was not a communist, and in fact claimed he could never be a communist. He said, "How can I be a communist? I went to a Jesuit school. Do you want me to renounce God to be a communist? I couldn't possibly do that." He was a nationalist in the old terminology. He was a left-wing nationalist. In other words, he was someone who just wanted to throw off the colonial yoke of Cuba. Cuba had been a colony of Spain for 400 years. In 1899, 1900, they threw off that yoke and became an independent company, but all they did was swap Spain for America. America became its colonial power for the next 50, 60 years. Anything that was worth owning in Cuba was owned by either the Americans, by American companies, or the mafia, or people with American connections, or stooges for the American mafia, or stooges for American companies. It was all controlled by America, as South America was. Batista, of course, was propped up by the Americans. He'd been there for ages. He'd been there 2 or 3 times over the course of 30 years. He, of course, was salting money away into Swiss banks. As long as he wasn't a communist, the Americans would support him. The Americans were always distrustful of Fidel Castro, even though Fidel Castro, up until 1959, Fidel Castro was a great admirer of America. Franklin Roosevelt was his hero. He wrote to Franklin Roosevelt when he was about 13 years of age. He wrote him a fan letter, which is in the Library of Congress. They found it sometime later, sometime after Fidel became famous. They found this letter among Roosevelt's, FDR's private papers, a fan letter from Fidel Castro asking for a signed photograph, an autographed photo that he sent to him, which never was. So he was an admirer of America. He wanted to give Cuba its independence, its Declaration of Independence, the way that America had done from Great Britain. But America didn't trust him, because anyone who was rebellious in the south of Florida had to be a communist. So they were prepared to back anyone who was not a communist, and they were backing Batista. Fidel, when he achieved that victory in 1959, New Year's Day, one of the first things he did over the course of the next 12 months was nationalise the important industries of Cuba. Now, he always maintained that he was going to recompense the original owners of those things, like the sugar companies, the United Fruit Company is the biggest sugar company, the telephone companies, the mining companies, all the major utilities. These were all foreign owned. He always said he was going to recompense them, but of course he had no money in the treasury, because Batista had taken it all. So over the course of time, over the course of a matter of months, he went to the Americans and asked them for loans, for assistance, for grants, etc. Well, the Americans, well, you're a communist. Sorry, we don't trust you. You've nationalised all our industries. He said, yes, but once we're back on our feet, that will all be taken care of. Well, he couldn't get what he wanted out of the Americans. Within about 12 months, of course, the Russians said, we'll give you whatever you want. Now, so that's why by about 1960, Fidel Castro became a proclaimed communist and was a completely different person to the Fidel Castro of 1958, who was a naive, struggling young student who'd spent 5 years in the... the previous 5 years he spent in the Sierra, in the mountains, in the jungle. Before that, he had spent about a year in Mexico in exile. Before that, he'd spent 2 years in prison. And before that, he was a very young revolutionary who attacked a barracks in Santiago de Cuba, trying to set up the revolution with about 80 men. They attacked a barracks. Most of them got wiped out. Fidel and his brother Raul were thrown into jail for, they were thrown into jail for a long period of time, but eventually they were released after only 2 years, but they were banished from the country. They went to live in, they went to Mexico, gave them sanctuary in Mexico, and that's where he met Che Guevara, and that's where he spent the next 12 months organising his next revolution. So he was an idealistic young man, not like the Fidel Castro of 1960. The Fidel Castro I write about is the idealistic young man. When Fidel and Errol came together, the reason they came together is because Errol needed Fidel to, he wanted to meet Fidel because Fidel was a genuine hero and he was always the artificial hero. He liked to be associated with genuine heroes. So he wanted, and he also needed the Fidel's approval to shoot film the battles in the revolution to make his film. From Fidel's point of view, he wanted to meet Errol Flynn because he was an unknown at that stage. Outside of Cuba, no one knew who he was. He was just one of many rebels that have been in Cuba over the years, and this one was up in the mountains of in the Sierra Maestra. He regarded Errol Flynn as perhaps a means of getting publicity. He wanted to be on the front pages of the papers. He had been before and he liked it. He'd been on the front page of the New York Times twice and he liked that sort of publicity. But now he wanted to be on television, he wanted to be on the Huntley and Brickney program, he wanted to be on the Ed Murrow program, he wanted to be taken seriously as a revolutionary. Perhaps Errol Flynn, the famous Errol Flynn, was a means of him doing that. That's why he was attracted to them. But to Errol. But when you think about the nature of these two men, there was always going to be conflict. There was always going to be conflict. They would be attracted, but like the aging stag and the young buck, which is the metaphor I use all the time, they are bound to butt heads together and to come into conflict. And as drama is conflict, that was the basis for a really good story. That's perhaps now, if you had a question, but maybe you can lead off. But I'll try and answer any of your questions about the story. Don't go too deeply into Cuban politics because I'm not interested in Cuban politics these days. I'm interested in Cuban politics at the time of the revolution. Cuban politics these days is a bit of a strange one, but 1958, 1959, it was very straightforward and easy to understand.
Yeah, it was after that other talk he gave. It was interesting to see how in other talks, whether they repeat, like a lot of academics do. You know, they get on a full bottle of their interest, and then
sure.
wherever they are in the trail, there's all the same.
So did I repeat myself too much?
No, you're very good. You're actually the best. I say this publicly. I go to a lot because I'm a writer myself and an artist, and most of the people who write books are so boring when they talk. Really.
Well, I've got a good subject.
You really like the words out there that you're up to the top. But a lady said to me after the Customs House that he won a boat. Errol Flynn says. And she said to me, who did he win it off? I said, well, I don't know. But it might have been like Perscalia or someone in Sydney, you know, one of the big gamblers. But
a bit before his time, I think. A bit before his time. This
would
have been, yeah. Yes, he did. Well, this is what he says. He claims.
Off, you know,
sorry?
He won it at car games, but who he won it off, that's what we're probably unlocking a few of the secrets of King's Cross and the Forbes Club or something. I don't know whether you know that, who he won it off.
No, look, he probably didn't know who he won it off either. Look, he was only in his 20s.
Yeah.
He probably stumbled into a card game, and next thing you know, he's won a boat. Now, that's the sort of thing that used to happen to him. When I say he went looking for adventure, this was a daily occurrence with him. He used to go into a bar and end up in a brawl. Now, he didn't go in there throwing his weight around. It's just that often film stars these days, or celebrities these days, you talk about rugby league players, they go into bars and someone picks on them because you're not, someone says you're not so tough, and next thing you know, there's a fight. Well, that used to happen to him. He would go into a bar, and he was famous for being this sword fighter, this fighter, in so many Hollywood films. So next thing you know, someone is up there saying, "You're not so tough." Well, he could not resist a challenge. Now, there's a famous story about Errol Flynn. This was written by David Niven. I'm probably repeating myself now. This was written by David Niven in his second book. His first book was called The Moon's a Balloon, and the second one was called Bring on the Empty Horses. Now, Bring on the Empty Horses is a quote from an Errol Flynn film called Charge of the White Brigade. It's a quote by Michael Curtiz, the director. Michael Curtiz directed Errol Flynn in, I'm not sure, about 10 films, and they did not like one another. They, once again, bang, they used to butt heads. And he was the man who made him a star. He directed Captain Blood. He directed, this one, Charge of the White Brigade. Many of his top films were directed by Michael Curtiz. Now, Michael Curtiz was a Hungarian. He had broken English, and he used to rub Errol up the wrong way, and Errol used to rub him up the wrong way. So they were constantly bickering on the set. Now, during the making of the Charge of the Light Brigade, for the actual charge, of course, you've got 500 horsemen, you've got 500 mounted horsemen. Now, there's Errol Flynn up the front, as he has to be. He's a good horseman. He's up the front. There's David Niven just behind him. There's a lot of stuntmen, really, really good riders from westerns and so on, all the stuntmen. And then behind that, you've got, members of the US Cavalry, who knows, a lot of other mounted men mounted on horses. While Errol was up the front there, one of the stuntmen, a very rough, tough guy, cowboy, rodeo rider, steer wrestler and all that sort of stuff, he decided he was going to tickle Errol Flynn's fancy. He had a lance, and what he did was tickle the horse's fancy with the end of his lance. Now the horse, like that, off went Errol Flynn onto his back. Errol got up and said, "Who did that?" And of course everyone was laughing, and this guy said, "Me. What are you going to do about it?" Well, that fellow got carted off to hospital, and Errol Flynn got back on his horse and did the same. Now, Errol Flynn used to get into bar brawls, but it was not always of his doing, but it often was. And he rarely came out second best. In his book, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, he talks about going to Shore School. He was expelled from there, as he was from a number of other schools. But he talks about going there, and of course he wasn't the biggest boy in the school, but he was very athletic. He was the school swimming champion, the school tennis champion, etc. So you won't find this on any honour boards at Shore. They rubbed his name out. They disowned him. But the school bully decided to pick on Errol. Well, in his book, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, he describes this fight. Now, once again, even if only half of it is true, this is a monumental fight that takes place down at Blues Point or McMahon's Point. They went down there and fought on the edge of the harbour and ended up in the water, and both of them nearly got drowned. But Errol Flynn won. He rarely walked away from a fight until he had won. So the card game, get back to your question about the card game, it's the sort of thing that he might have found himself in without certainly not aiming to be in it, but just found himself in it. He says he won a boat, and on that boat he sailed up. He recruited a crew and sailed up the east coast of Australia.
I thought it just came to me now, that being such a prominent vessel as it was, there'd probably be a list of who owned it at that time.
Well, that particular vessel was not the big, not necessarily, see, that was his first vessel, and it was called the Sirocco, but it wasn't the Sirocco he had later.
No, but still, it was some sort of prominent ship in the Australian.
Yeah, I don't know if it still exists.
Not that from you, actually. I thought
No, you're thinking of the Zaka. Now, what? See, he had the Sirocco, which is the boat he won in the card game,
Yes.
but then I don't know what happened to that. He sold it, he lost it, it sank. I don't know. And then he took himself off to Europe, and then up in America. When he got to America, he bought himself a new boat, and he called it Sirocco. Now, any sailor will tell you don't change the name of the boat. Well, he changed the name of that boat, whatever it was. He called it the Sirocco, and he had a lot of trouble with that boat. And I think he lost that boat in a storm or something. Then he bought a boat called the Zaka, and he kept the name the Zaka. I don't know. I can't remember what Zaka means. It's some island, something from the South Sea Islands, a name from the South Sea Island, God or something or other. Now, that boat was 110 feet long. It was the biggest privately owned boat, the biggest privately owned pleasure craft in the world at that time, 110-foot schooner. Yes, that boat still exists. He owned that boat for 10 or 15 years, and that was the boat he used to escape on. He spent a couple of years sailing all around the world on it, lost in a drunken haze, escaping from Hollywood, escaping from his wives, escaping from responsibility, and sailing around the world in, as I say, in a drunken stupor. Now, that boat was also part of the story of his death. That was one of the last assets he had. He had some land in Jamaica, and he had this boat. And finally, he was going to sell that boat, and he was going to sell it to someone he knew up in Vancouver. He took himself up to Vancouver to sell the boat, and died in Vancouver the day after signing over the boat. Now, the boat ended up in the hands of a Middle Eastern potentate of some sort. Now, it's been renovated a number of times, and it's still around. It's still around with a history. And part of that history was Errol Flynn's rape trial, statutory rape trial, because that was supposed to be the venue for the incident.
By the same token, even if Sirocco was a small boat, the knowledge of boats around Sydney it's probably something you, with your story, probably could find out who did.
Yeah, well, maybe it's not called the Sirocco anymore. You know.
No, but a register of ships at that time.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. This is 1931, 32.
When the Sydney Outback Gold Race was, I don't think it's still going now, I'm not sure. Probably was.
Well, I suppose it was, but in 1932, the middle of the Depression, I mean, the person who lost the boat, I can't imagine Errol's running down to the I don't know, the merchant shipping register and entering his name. I think he's probably on the boat and off because someone's after him with a gun or a knife or something.
No,
Right?
but the bloke who wrote it, that's what I meant. You know,
Yeah,
that was the
could be.
lady who put to me, she said, who did you win it off? It's a
Yeah.
So that don't work.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
Abe Saffron. Now, how
Oh,
about that?
that's it, Hollywood George or something.
Hollywood George. Hollywood George, yes.
Probably Packer.
Sorry?
Might have been Packer.
Packer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been, well, it'd have to be Frank Packer.
Yes, exactly.
Could have been. Yes, it could have been. Yes.
My partner's father was actually at Shaw School when Errol Flynn was there. And the way he remembers Errol Flynn was that Errol Flynn wasn't there for very long. I don't think it was even a year. But when he left still owing money to my partner's father that he'd lost in a bet with him and never ever paid him. And that's the way he remembered him.
Well, look, yes, that was what he was like. That was one of the many flaws in his character, was being a lovable rogue and unreliable. Now, David Niven talks about him being unreliable. I think by the time David Niven wrote his books, which was 15 years after Errol died, he didn't necessarily remember him all that fondly. They obviously had a falling out because David Niven doesn't feature very much in Errol's own book. And I think they shared a house together in Santa Monica or Malibu, and it was called, they called the house Cirrhosis by the Sea. So it gives you an idea of what the lifestyle those two had. And relevant to that particular story you have. When that was a rented house, it was rented from another big Hollywood star, and because Errol was on the bigger contract and David Niven was a second string star, Errol said he would pay the bulk of the rent, but he would have the biggest of the bedrooms. So David Niven had a small bedroom. Apparently, I've seen pictures of this house. It's not a small house, but it obviously had more than 2 bedrooms. But I don't know, maybe the others will turn into bars or something. But David Niven's room wasn't small enough for his trysts. So he used to come to an arrangement with Errol. He'd say, "Can I have your room tonight?" And Errol would say, "Certainly you can, old boy." And then he would adjust their rent accordingly. I've heard another story. This was sent to me by someone. Very kindly sent me an excerpt out of his grandfather's diary. His grandfather was a recruiter up in Bougainville, or New Britain, as it was then, and that's what Errol was at one stage. A recruiter was someone who went off into the villages and found young men to work the copra plantations or whatever plantations there were around. Now, recruiter is one term for it, blackbird is another term for it, because often they used to kidnap them. And, they used to call them Kanakas, if you remember, they were called Kanakas. Anyone of an island, anyone who had an islander background, either anywhere in the South Pacific, New Mea, New Hebrides, New Britain, anyone who was recruited into the cane fields, the copra plantations and so on, they called them Kanakas. Now, often these people were not recruited; they were shanghaied. Now, Errol, this fellow tells the story of how Errol, as a recruiter, went into a village, and he went to the head man. Now, you got to understand that these villagers had no idea how money, because they used to barter, they used to trade in beads, or I don't know what they traded in, copra, coconut, people, pigs. Well, they used to get coins, used to get silver and gold coins. So and they never knew where these coins came from. They thought, it must come off a tree. Money grows on trees, or you dig it up out of the ground or whatever. Well, Errol went there and he had a cigar box. Apparently, it was a Monopole Magnum box, and he fiddled with this thing and put a winder on it and a little mouth, and he would wind it half a dozen times, and a coin would pop out. A florin would pop out. So he went up to the chief, and he didn't say he was there to recruit. He said he was there to buy, to buy things, to buy jungle produce from them. And then he ran out of money. He said, "Oh, I haven't got any more money to buy anything else. So I'll tell you what, I'll get my money making machine or box maker money, whatever it is in pidgin English." And he proceeded to make some coins. And of course, the chief suddenly saw, "Oh, here it is. This is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. This is where the white man gets his money from." So he said, "What can I give you for that machine?" He said, "Oh, I couldn't sell you that machine." He said, "Well, I'll give you anything for that machine." He said, "All right. How about 50 of your strongest young men?" So the chief organised 50 of his strongest young men. Errol gave him that and took off very quickly before the chief managed to find out. Now, there's Errol, lovable rogue, but absolute bastard when it comes to some things.
He's a real con.
Con man, yes.
He's a con.
Yes, that's right.
How we turn it down.
That's right.
Con man. Knew exactly what he was doing.
Of course he did. Yeah.
Yes, I've met many like that.
You have? Are you still married?
Did your interest come from an interest in Errol Flynn or from Cuba? Where did you come across?
Yeah, well, that's interesting you say that. Yes, it came. I was in the middle of writing another manuscript, which was using Errol Flynn as a basis for a character. Now, when I say that, how characters you draw from many other real people. You take characteristics from certain people and you create a character. Well, this particular character was probably about 50% Errol Flynn. without the con man, without the absolute bastard, without the undependability, without the film star, without the job as a film star. But the athleticism and the charm and the looks, those on the positive side of the ledger, they were the characteristics that I was building into a character. He had his flaws as well. My character had flaws as well, but they weren't the same flaws as Errol Flynn. And I happened to be watching a documentary as research for this other manuscript, and I saw a documentary. It's an Australian-produced documentary called Tasmanian Devil. I don't know, the life and times of Errol Flynn, but Tasmanian Devil was its major title. And I watched. There was nothing in it I didn't know, but I mean, if you read My Wicked Ways, there's his story. And if you read David Niven and a couple of other books, the Earl Conrad book, you'll find the other side of the ledger that Errol wasn't prepared to confess to. So there was nothing I didn't know in the documentary until it got to the end, where it said this. He went down to Cuba for an adventure to make this film, and when Cuba fell, it was Errol Flynn who released the story to the world. Now, that was where my interest was spiked. I found myself looking into that, looking more and more into it. What I was fascinated by was, yes, the preposterousness of this meeting, but then I felt that actually these were two men who were destined to come together. Given the opportunity, they were destined to be attracted to one another, and that's where I was really interested. So I put the other manuscript aside and then wrote this one. So the other manuscript is now finished, so that one comes out next year. And I've had to go back and fiddle with the character, not to make him too much like Errol Flynn.
And street talking as one does, I happened to mention that I'd been to this talk by this fellow that you about Errol Flynn, and the guy said, "Yeah, you're in a tin mine." I mean, you can, maybe that was where
Copper mine.
Oh, copper, was it?
And a gold mine. He was a gold miner. He was the manager of a copper plantation, or copper mine, copper plantation, sorry. He was the manager of a copper plantation for one of the larger,
Unilever or something.
Not Unilever, Elders.
Okay.
Elders or one of those big trading companies up there. He had a gold mine, but he made more from selling his gold mine than he did from actually digging up gold. There was a mountain up there with little men scurrying all over it, and he didn't want to be one of those, so he probably conned someone else into buying his gold mine.
It was in between two big mines, and they wanted to join together, I think. And so it was actually even though there's no gold, it was worth a lot of money. So.
Oh, you know the subject.
No, I think it was mentioned in My Wicked Ways.
Right.
I want to know where and how did he fit? Was it 3 marriages? Where do the women that he married come into his whole story? Did he ever settle down, or was he always on the boat?
No. No, he never settled down.
So where were the women in his life?
Well, the first woman he married, Lily Demeter, and Patrice Wymore, that was the
one I
that was the third one.
She was
Yeah.
in the Western movies.
She was the third, that's right. Now, he met Lily Demeter on the boat coming from London, from Europe to America. Cut a long story short, he found himself in London when he was in his early 30s in a Northampton repertory company. He was a repertory actor, he did that for about 18 months. Now, there's a book actually being written called, look, I can't remember what it's called, but it's essentially the story of Errol Flynn's time with the Northampton repertory company. Now, if you know anything about repertory acting and repertory companies, they do standard classic plays, and the actors are a different character in a different play every night. So you learn very quickly. You learn to learn your lines, and you learn stagecraft very quickly. He was seen over there by a Warner Brothers scout who offered him a contract. So he was on a boat over to America. He met Lily Demeter. Now, has anyone ever heard of Lily Demeter?
No.
You have?
No, just from reading.
Oh, My Wicked Ways, right, okay. Lily Demeter, in 1932, was the biggest female star in Hollywood. Now, you never hear of her now, but she was French. She was absolutely gorgeous, and she was a huge Hollywood star. Now, she met Errol Flynn, who was a nobody, but they had an affair on the boat. Next thing you know, he's living with her. He's a struggling actor. She's a big Hollywood star. And then about, I don't know, 12 months later, he did Captain Blood. Plucked out of obscurity virtually to do Captain Blood. And he became a huge star. Well, suddenly he was a bigger star than Lily, so Lily decided, well, I can't compete with that. So I'm not going to I'm going to retire from Hollywood and live off Errol Flynn. Now, when I say live off Errol Flynn, I use that term advisedly because she took him for everything he had. After they divorced, she took him for everything. Over a long period, right up until the day he died, she was still after his assets, and she got most of them. That was his first wife. Now, he had a tempestuous relationship with Lily Demeter, and he was one of the reasons he says he took himself off to the Spanish Civil War, was to get away from Lily. Darling Lil, as he called her. I can't remember when he divorced her, but then his second wife, now once again, if someone had made this up, you wouldn't believe it. In the middle of his rape trial in Los Angeles, there was a cigar store, a cigarette store outside the courthouse, and there was a young 18-year-old woman serving in that cigarette store. Her name was forgotten her name. Anyway, she became his second wife. He struck up a relationship with her in the middle of his rape trial, and her father was a police sergeant. So he struck up a relationship. What's her name? Anyway, he struck up a relationship with her, and that was his second wife. That lasted for a few years, but I mean, none of Errol Flynn's marriages really lasted beyond the honeymoon. After that, it was on and off for a couple of years. Then he divorced her, or they divorced, and his third wife, Patrice Wymore, he met on a film called Rocky Mountain, which was
She was always in Western movies.
Yes, well, this was one of her first films. So, and she came from a respectable family on the East Coast somewhere. And when they heard that, that Errol Flynn was sniffing around and so on, the family was very sus about the whole thing. But he managed to charm them, of course, and she became his third wife, Patrice. He was still married to her when he died. They weren't living together. She was living in Jamaica by this stage. He bought a lot of property in Jamaica. He had a hotel there at one stage. And that was as much home as anywhere in the world by that stage, because Lily had everything else. Lily had all his American property.
So apart from being a con man and a charmer, he did make money along the way.
Oh yes, he was very highly paid.
And he lost everything.
He was one of the highest paid in Hollywood. In those days, the studio system, you were paid a weekly salary. You weren't paid per film. You were paid a weekly salary, and his was one of the highest in Hollywood. And for some years, it was the highest. Yes, but he wasn't. He didn't invest wisely. I mean, he lived in the Hollywood Hills, up in Mulholland Drive, and he had a lovely house up there. That house has been owned by it's still there. It's been owned by several film stars since. But it's always been known as Errol Flynn's home. And that was his favourite house. He lived in that place for many, many years. Well, Lily ended up with that by about 1955, which by this stage he was onto his third wife, and Lily ended up with that house.
And back in Hobart, I think I was saying he went to the French school, which is a quite good.
Is that a young school? A primary school?
I think that's the whole lot, yeah.
The whole lot? Yeah, most of his secondary schooling was outside of Tasmania. When he was at Shore, he was a boarder, and his parents were in Europe. His father was professor of marine biology at Trinity College in Dublin. His mother was cavorting around Europe. Now, his mother had a reputation like his for being
Notorious.
Notorious. She was for being notorious. She had affairs all over Europe. So, look. He had a terrible relationship with his mother. Once again, he was doing this. Now that's probably where it all came from. Everyone blames their mother. Well, he did, and there's probably a lot of truth in it. And that's not her fault. That's the fault of both of them. The both of them. But he felt that she had deserted him. He says at one stage, he said, what do I know about love? You learn love in the cradle, right? So what would I know about it? And he says that in My Wicked Wicked Ways. Now that's a telling insight into his problems. He says also that he was always running away from his mother, but he was always trying to find her. So the relationships he had, you know, I'm not a psychologist, but the relationships he had were trying to find his mother, but his actual mother, he was always trying to escape from.
That would have been a security thing, knowing she was still there.
Yes, and he tried, and also that he tried. I think in the other women, he was looking for his mother, for his ideal mother, the way he wanted his mother to be. And of course, no woman can ever do that for you. For him, no woman can ever do that. So that's why his relationships never lasted.
And he was the only child?
No, he had a sister, but you never hear much about her. I don't know what he never talked about it, but she was there. She used to come out to when he had the hotel in Jamaica. His parents used to visit him out there quite a lot, and his mother would come and try to take over the hotel. And once again, he'd get in his plane or on his boat and disappear. Couldn't take it anymore because his mother would be there telling everyone what to do. And his sister used to visit him in Jamaica as well. That's about the only time he ever talks about his sister, his younger sister. But getting back to the, what was the question before that? It was, about schools. So while they were in Europe, he went to boarding school in London, a couple of boarding schools, well, not in London, in England, one in London, one outside of London. And then he went to Shaw. He was sent back because he got expelled from the ones in the UK. They sent him to Shaw. He got into Shaw even with his record because of his father, you know, the emeritus professor, Errol Flynn. So that's how he got into Shaw. And yes, he only lasted there less than a year, and he was expelled for interfering with. Well, I shouldn't say she was interfering with him. The laundry maid, who was twice his age. He got into trouble with the laundry maid, who was twice his age, and he got expelled. He got caught. The way he explains it in his book, he used to jump out of his dorm, which was a bit up from the ground on the first floor. He used to jump out and go and rendezvous with the laundry maid. And one of his nemesis in the school, probably the bully that he had the big fight with, put some corrugated iron under the window. So when he jumped out, it made a hell of a racket and woke the whole dormitory up, and that's how he got caught.
So he was 50 when he died.
Yeah.
And, so when was he born?
1909.
1909.
Last year.
Okay.
Last year was the 100th anniversary of his birth and the 50th anniversary of his death. I don't know if you saw the publicity, but they had an Errol Flynn festival down in Hobart, and his daughter, one of his daughters, came out.
Oh, he did have children?
Yes, oh yes, he had 4 children.
Oh, that's what I was wondering.
He had 4. There's two who's still alive. His eldest was by Lily Demeter, Sean Flynn. He was as good looking as his father. He was a gorgeous boy. He became a photojournalist. He went to Vietnam and disappeared in Cambodia. If you've seen Apocalypse Now, the character played by Dennis Hopper. If you remember Dennis Hopper, when they sail up the river into that madhouse with all the shrunken heads and so on, and Dennis Hopper's running around with the camera, that's based on Sean. That character's based on Sean Flynn. So he died in about 1970, 71. And Lily Demeter never gave up looking for him because he disappeared. No one was ever. They think they found his bones earlier this year or last year. They think they found his skeleton, but she never stopped looking for him. She made many trips to Vietnam or Cambodia trying to find him. With his second wife, who's Nora Eddington. That's his second wife's name. His second wife, Nora. He had 2 daughters. and they are still alive. And then with his third wife, Patrice, he had one daughter who died, I think, in about 10, 15 years ago. She died of problems associated with drugs, so I guess that was hereditary. Because Errol Errol wasn't just the alcohol. Errol was a drug. He abused any drug he could find.
Yeah.
Any drug. He was a morphine addict up until the day he died.
Oh, really?
Mm. The way he describes it in the book, he got hold.
He got to 50.
During the Second World War, towards the end of the Second World War, the army used to make these little syrettes, they call little one-time needles with morphine for the really bad cases. When someone had a really bad wound, they would stick them with a syringe of morphine, and that would eventually, so they could stand the pain until they died. So they didn't die of pain. That's essentially what it was for. Well, he got himself a supply of these after the war, and they lasted him for quite a while. I'm not sure what the use-by date was, but he had them for quite a while. So he became addicted to morphine. It didn't cause him problems because he had money.
What a personality.
Oh yeah. Well,
I mean, you know, you wouldn't want to sort of get too close, I wouldn't think.
Well, see,
It's a
once
personality, yes.
that's right. Now, if you think again of Fidel Castro, that's someone you don't want to get too. That was someone you didn't want to get too close to either.
Yeah, but it's a personality. Yes, but
For
it's
different
a personality.
reasons. For different reasons, but when Fidel first got power, you know, the old story about divide and conquer. If anyone got a little power, he would cut them down. He was constantly changing the ministry. Eventually Che Guevara couldn't stand it anymore. He left, and that's when he went to Bolivia. Or he went to other places and ended up in Bolivia. But essentially, he couldn't stand dealing with Fidel Castro's ego anymore. Now, I don't think, I mean, everyone's got an ego, obviously, but I don't think Errol's ego was his fatal flaw. He had many other fatal flaws, but I don't think it was his ego. He was
Women were his fatal flaw.
women and drugs, addictions. You know, addictions were his fatal flaw, and he was addicted to women. He was addicted to drugs. He was addicted to adventure. He had many addictions.
Yes, women adrenaline.
Sorry, and adrenaline. Yes, that's right.
Interesting.
Yeah, having done so much research, obviously, for your book and previously, how much of the factual, the events of My Wicked Ways would you say are actually true? Because I haven't read much into that, but obviously it's very sensationalised,
Yeah.
a lot of it. But I mean, even just the whole section on 7 seas to England going from Australia, you read some of that and you're like, surely that didn't happen. But then you hear other things and maybe.
Well, if you remember, he says in that book, in My Wicked Ways, he says, when I arrived in Hollywood, and I told my story to the publicity people I hired to create a story, to create a background story to the private life. With him, they were hired to put a lid on it, so the story wouldn't get out. Yes, when he went from Australia to Europe, and he travelled all around the place with a guy he calls in the book, he calls him Victor Palin. Kurtz.
Kurtz, yeah.
Kurtz, Victor Kurtz. Now that's not his real name.
Yeah, no, it says in the foreword, or what his real name was. But,
Oh, you got the new edition.
Yeah.
You got the edition with the foreword written by Earl Conrad.
Yes, yeah, that one.
And Earl Conrad was his ghostwriter for My Wicked Ways.
In Jamaica. Yeah.
That's right. Kurtz wasn't his real name because Kurtz was a Nazi, and I think he wanted to. Errol was a bit, he was a bit, I suppose, sensitive about being associated with someone of his reputation, which is the reason why that book was written in the 70s that said he was a Nazi, because he spent quite a lot of time with this very good friend of his travelling around the world who was a Nazi.
And they went to the Spanish Civil War together.
Yeah.
That thing in the book where it's from Kurtz, I arrived tomorrow with 1,000 monkeys. And that saying he was coming, that's all it said in the note. And then he arrived the next day and they took off to Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, and Kurtz's sympathies were on the other side, and Errol's were on the loyalist side. His were with Franco. In fact, he was probably there on a mission. The Kurtz, or whatever his name was, character. Yeah, the adventures that he writes about in the book. Look, a lot of people say you can take half of it with a grain of salt, and maybe that's true. But even if only half of them are true, it's quite
But even more like, because what the war that he said they joined up in the Japanese.
Yeah, in China.
Yeah,
He got involved he got involved with the warlords in China and so on. Well, who knows? Look, even before he left, he says he was involved with the razor gangs in Sydney. Now, in the 1920s, he's writing this book in 1958 in Jamaica. It's a long way from Sydney in 1925. You can say anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone knew, anyone who was in Sydney in the 1920s knew about the razor gangs and knew you didn't mess with them. But you know, 1950s on the other side of the world, who's ever going to check it out? So I take the razor, I don't know, the razor thing. And he said he lived in the domain after he got expelled from Shaw. He was afraid to tell his parents that he'd been expelled from another school. He was about 16 by then. He was probably his last year of school. So he didn't sit what would have been the leaving certificate because he just took off and
he would not have got it anyway.
No, that's right.
No,
that's right. And he always regretted the fact that he didn't take formal education seriously, and he educated himself, and he became an amateur classical scholar, very much an amateur. But when he was on the up in New Britain, living on a copper plantation, there was no one to talk to. He was there by himself with a lot of the plantation workers who spoke only broken pidgin English. And so there was no one to talk to, so he got books sent up to him from libraries and by his father and so on. And he sat there and read all the Greeks, he read all the French humanists, all the German philosophers and so on and so on. So he educated himself. And as a result of that, he always regretted the fact that he'd never taken formal education seriously, and by then it was too late. In fact, one of the reasons he ended up in the UK was he thought he might be able to bluff his way into one of the universities. Well, that didn't happen. But he ended up in a refugee.
Fascinating. I didn't realise, I mean, I knew a little bit about his background because I'm not exactly young, so I've always sort of followed Errol Flynn through some of his movies, but I didn't realise all this background.
The first film he made was called In the Wake of the Bounty. It was made by Charles Chevelle. If anyone knows anything about Australian film history, Charles Chevelle. While Errol was sailing up the east coast of Australia in that boat that he won in a poker game.
Didn't he get the Orpheum going?
He might have, yeah.
Chevelle.
Yeah, Chevelle.
I wouldn't be at all surprised. Errol won this boat in the card game that we talked about earlier, and sailed up the east coast of Australia and got into difficulties in a storm or ran the boat aground or whatever. And that story ended up in the papers in Melbourne, and there was a picture. If you search long enough, you'll find the picture. If you Google long enough, you'll find it. There's a picture of these men on the deck of a boat. There's about 3 or 4 of them, and one of them is Errol Flynn, and he looks like the classic swashbuckling sailor. But in those days he was, I don't know, he was in his 20s, and he was just an adventurer. Charles Chevelle saw that picture and arranged to get a screen test. Eventually got in touch with him and arranged for him to do a screen test for his film In the Wake of the Bounty, and that's how Errol Flynn ended up playing Fletcher Christian. He had no acting experience, and if you've ever seen that film, you don't find that difficult to believe because it's an awful performance. It's it's one of those shot window dummy performances. Some would say he did that a lot throughout his career, but he had the looks, and that was all that mattered. So he decided he liked this acting lark. So he decided he was going to take himself up to Europe. Maybe he could get a job acting. Maybe he could get himself into a university. Who knows? Maybe I can just have an adventure. And that's when he gets hooked up with this guy, Kurtz, so-called Kurtz, and they travel all around the place, all through Asia and China and India and the Middle East, and they end up in Europe. He ends up in London. Next thing you know, he probably bluffs his way into a repertory company. Yes, of course, I was the star of a film. And so, then he had the looks.
Gee,
And he was-
he's had a lot into 50 years.
Yes, he did.
Is that when he made his Robin Hood?
No, Captain Blood was made in about 1935. Then he made a couple of other big films, Charge of the White Brigade. Robin Hood was about 1938. By then he was the biggest star in Hollywood, but he wasn't the first choice for Robin Hood. Now this is one of the first ever colour films, not the first, but the first big colour film. The first choice, if you can get your mind around it, was James Cagney.
Oh, get out of here.
Yeah, get out of here. Yeah, James Cagney. I suppose the reason they called James Cagney because he was a dancer. He was a dancer before he was an actor. If you ever see where he plays George M. Cohan, Yankee Doodle Dandy, he was a good dancer. Now Errol Flynn could dance as well, not as well as James Cagney, but he was a good dancer. But I can't remember James Cagney. He wasn't the first choice for Captain Blood. The first choice was Robert Durner. Because he was quite big then, the English star. So Robin Hood was about 1938, and of course he became the classic Robin Hood. There must be about 10 films made about Robin Hood, up to the
Didn't they
last
show
one.
that recently on television?
Well, probably because the Russell Crowe
Errol
film.
Flynn?
The Russell
Because
Crowe film.
I've seen something recently with Errol Flynn.
Well, the Russell Crowe film came out earlier this year, so the Errol Flynn one was probably programmed to coincide.
I think it was. Yes, they showed all the...
Douglas Fairbanks also did Robin Hood.
Yes.
He did it back in the
So
silent
you're
days.
looking for a script writer to write the film for the book?
Yeah.
Who would you cast?
Interesting you should say that, because my son is a film student. And I asked him exactly that question. I said, who? And he came, because I'd been talking about it with a couple of colleagues, and the best we came up, well, we didn't get much thought, but the best we came up with at that time was an Australian actor, I think it was Guy Pearce. Because he's sort of got the classic face, the high cheekbones, but he doesn't have the presence, he doesn't have the athleticism, the physical. I mean, Errol Flynn could walk into a room and cause all the eyes to turn. He just had that magnetism about it, which is very difficult to find, in an actor who also has athletic ability. But when you think about this is 1958, he doesn't have any of that athletic ability. He also was a man who had a very strong vein of self-deprecating humour. He was never afraid to take the mickey out of himself. So anyway, I put this to my son, and he said, we're giving it about 2 seconds thought, said George Clooney.
Good God.
And I thought, that's,
George Clooney.
he's the only person, only big Hollywood person who has that charm, has that ability when he walks into a room to make all the eyes turn. Not athletic.
No, I was going to say
But-
physique is not athletic.
But Errol, this is 1958, he's about the same age as Errol, was in 1958.
Mr. for Smile too.
Yeah, or killer
And
smile.
charisma.
Yeah, that's right, the charisma, that's right. And then for Fidel Castro,
Yes.
Javier Bardem. You could not go past Javier Bardem.
Yes. Wonderful.
Now, wouldn't he love to play Fidel Castro?
He does.
I reckon any Spanish actor would love to play, Spanish-speaking actor would love to play Fidel Castro. Especially Fidel Castro of 1958, 1959, when he really was a hero, before he turned into a, some would say tyrant, before he turned it, before...
Do you bring Kennedy into any of this?
No.
You don't?
No.
Nothing to do
This
with
finishes...
Kennedy?
The Fidel Castro involvement in the story finishes in the middle of 1959, which is when he makes his first trip to New York after the revolution. He went to New York at the invitation of what is essentially the National Press Club. I'm not sure what it was called, but the Press Association of America invited Fidel Castro. He was not invited by the American government. President Eisenhower made sure he wasn't in town. Went off to play golf. Whenever Fidel Castro was around, he made sure he wasn't around. That's as far as I take Fidel Castro in the book. Errol Flynn lasts for another 6 months, another 4 or 5 months, which is when he dies. The book finishes Christmas 1959, so Kennedy wasn't even running for president by that stage. He was still an obscure senator from Massachusetts.
I met an Aussie who had met Che Guevara. Don't know what he was. I thought he was a newspaper bloke, but in the jungles, I said.
In Cuba?
Oh, it could have been Errol or Mexico, wherever he was, but you know, it was just one of those things that they call a brush with flame or something.
Yeah.
But I know, as you said the other time, he got shunted out of Cuba, so there'd be no way that Guevara, Castro, and Flynn ever sort of got over a card game or something.
No, but they did. No, the thing about Che Guevara was with Errol Flynn, he never trusted Errol Flynn. Fidel Castro was charmed by him, but Che Guevara never trusted him. There were meetings, and I do have a meeting of Flynn and Che Guevara in the book, just so that I can express that thought that Che Guevara was a much smarter man than Fidel was at that stage, and he didn't trust him.
Not to thread them together either.
You had to do more research and write a continuation.
Yeah. Part 2.
Where you left off.
Well, that's, you see, America. This is the thing: is that when it comes to Fidel Castro, Americans have covered the waterfront with Fidel Castro from 1960 on, from the time he was regarded as being communist and a person of no interest. And the embargo in 1961 and the Bay of Pigs and so on. Castro has been covered by thousands of American writers. I don't think there's anything I could write about Fidel Castro that's not already covered. What I found interesting about this was that although it was no secret that Errol Flynn had met with Castro, although it was no secret, no one had ever written more than a couple of paragraphs about it. Because no one was talking about it. Errol Flynn, when he got back to America after being chased out of Cuba, when he got back to America, he was happy to talk it up. Now, the way he made money in those days, this is the last 12 months of his life, was guest appearances on television programs. What's My Line, and Front Page Challenge, and things like that. So he was happy to talk up his connection with Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, for his part, when straight after the revolution, when the Americans poured into Cuba, when the foreign correspondents poured in, Fidel was happy to say, yes, but Errol Flynn was with us. A couple of days later, he was saying he'd never heard of him. So there was a big falling out between the two men. So Fidel wasn't talking about it. Errol was dead. No one else knew what the story was.
So it died.
Sorry?
It died.
So it died, yeah. It was front page news. It was front page news for a little while, and then it just died. Lack of oxygen, as they say. I think I've bored you enough.
Fascinating.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thank you.
That was
Thanks for the opportunity.
fascinating.